Well, hello everybody and welcome to the channel. Today it's a shootout of the Acoustic Sounds Analog Productions release of Jethro Tull's Benefit. That's coming up next on the Safe and Sound Texas Audio Excursion. Jethro Tull Benefit was the third released by the band, and it came out in 1970. Now, this record was one that I picked up later because I got into Tull in about 72 or so when I was in high school. So the copy that I have is a U.S. Chrysalis reissue, pressed at Columbia Terre Haute, Indiana. And it looks like the record's a bit of a Frankenstein. On side one, the way the stamping reads, it's from Reprise, which was the original label that this was put out on, and then they moved it to Chrysalis. Side two has a Chrysalis stamping ID. So this one is a bit of a mix, being a reissue, and that happened at plants when they were taking the stampings and moving them to get reissues done as the records were maybe more popular and selling more, and then they did these reissues. The front cover of this doesn't even indicate the label or the number or anything on it. So there was this transition period with Jethro Tull records where they started out on Reprise and then moved over to Chrysalis, where that became the baseline for them as their catalog matured. So this record now has come out by Analogue Productions on a 2x45RPM format, and it has in fact been remastered at the Mastering Lab. Now, as you may know, Chad Kassem bought the equipment from the Mastering Lab from the estate of the late great Doug Sachs, and he has it sitting in his Blue Heaven Studios in Salina, Kansas, in the old church in the upper loft area. And so this is where the actual mastering has been done by Matthew Luthans, and it also shows a Darian Piper involved on a couple of the sides as well. So what we have here is a homegrown mastering lab reincarnated, so to speak, with the record also pressed at Quality Records Pressing in Salina, Kansas as well. So this is a homegrown project for Chad, and it is in fact one that when I talk about Jethro Tull records, you see, I watched Jethro Tull many, many times, 13 times to be exact, in concert. When I got into Jethro Tull, I really got into them. And as I've said before, Jethro Tull was a touring monster. They would tour anywhere. They would tour and go into local gymnasiums even. And when they were even fairly popular and well known, they just really got out there. And Ian Anderson, being the showman that he is, really took that craft to almost a theatrical way of presenting the material that was done for records, and brought that to, as we can see in releases like Thick as a Brick and A Passion Play, these thematic type of records that really broke barriers and created new types of content. A maestro and a musician of the nth degree. Of course, Jethro Tull had the same thing like Pink Floyd.
What you talking about? What you talking about? What you talking about? What you talking about, Willis?
Like, which one's Pink? Well, which one's Jethro? Well, none of them were, of course. Ian Anderson was the lead man, but he never threw his name around. He just surrounded himself with great musicians. Unfortunately, one of the issues with the Jethro Tull catalog for me is I realized early on that these were not really great sounding records. Now, whether or not they weren't made that way and that was the way the tape was, or the way it was mastered, or the way it was engineered, I never, of course, knew, but it was something that seemed to be prevalent. So when one sees that a Jethro Tull record is being redone, to me that's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to peel back the layers, so to speak, of the onion and to hear what's really there. To the point where Steven Wilson redid a lot of their catalog and remixed, not just remastering, but remixed from the original multi-track tapes, many of their offerings. And I can honestly say that he really did bring a better presentation overall of the material through those remixes. Now, this particular issue from Analogue Productions is merely a remastering of the original 2-track analog tape. So it can only do so much. It can't do quite the magic that a Steven Wilson remixing can do. But how did it fare? I mean, this is something that I've always wondered, how good could these original tapes on 2-track be brought to the format of vinyl to sound better, because they always were a bit weak. And you're going to see in some of the numbers here that I'm going to be going through now that original clearly had a lot to be improved upon. So let's check out the numbers. The nature of audio comparisons is that the results presented in this video are fully subjective. They are based on my equipment in my listening room using my hearing capability. Therefore, your results may be different. My effort here is to provide you the relative difference of audio characteristics across various pressings. This shootout's going to be fairly short because it's only going to be the new Analogue Productions release against one original, which is actually a reissue that was done in 1973, and it was pressed at Columbia's facility in Terre Haute, Indiana. And as I mentioned, I've got a stamping on the side one that represents the original Reprise catalog number, and then on side two it has the Chrysalis catalog number etched in. So kind of a Frankenstein here, as it ends up being for this original, but it's a very cheap record to find, $10 for VG Plus. This isn't a difficult album to find. Didn't have a UK available to compare to or anything else. But again, that's a very inexpensive one to find. Now, the new one by Analogue Productions is $60. And again, it was done at the mastering lab set up there in Salina, Kansas, with Darian Piper and Matthew Luthans, who's actually the person that Chad has doing the mastering there for that facility. And it was again pressed at QRP in Salina as well. Now, this one, when we look at the relative dB, has a quieter presentation and needs to be boosted more. Now, the reason I don't talk about the Steven Wilson remaster, I'll get to that, but it is basically not an apples and apples because it's a remix. And I want to make that clear. It's very different. But let's focus on these two. So when it came to the quietness of the vinyl, the older one is definitely a noisier surface, and it only rated a 7.5 in quietness, whereas the new one was almost dead quiet, 9.5. It was extremely quiet. And there are a lot of places in these songs where the music tones down and you have maybe some light flute work or instrumental work, and you really can see that stand out. So the Analogue Productions definitely got a big boost in that area. And then across the board in the bass, mid, and treble, again, as I mentioned, this recording really is a bit muffled. It doesn't really have the same clarity that you would want to have. It's a bit muddy. Things are kind of squashed together. And that difference becomes a lot more apparent when you're listening to the new one. Now, granted, you got to boost the volume up on the new one, and then you get that bigger dynamic range out of it, whereas the original has a bit more of a compressed sound to it, and everything's kind of stuffed together. So the original got 7s across the board in the bass, mid, and trebles, and the new one 9.5s. Very strong, very distinct. For example, the kick drums are very distinct and can be felt and heard very separate from the music in the Analogue Productions release, whereas they're just kind of somewhere in the mix, literally somewhere there on the original, but it's all kind of mushed together. Same way with the mid-range and the voices. There's more clarity pulled out of Ian Anderson and more of that mid-range that basically is the heart of the sound that has real distinction and separation and clarity there that is not nearly as forthright in the original. And then on the treble, you definitely get some of those cymbal hits and some of the more high-end pieces of the flute playing that are much more crisp and sonically pleasing in the Analogue Productions that are really kind of just kind of laying there in wait on the original. So that was a fairly stark difference, and it just rode up and down through all the tracks, and the difference became more and more obvious as I got into songs that were even more and more familiar to me, the ones that I know best, like Teacher is probably one of my favorite songs on this record, and it really just it was like a whole new experience listening to it. So in that case, I think we have something that really, right out of the box, just shone very brightly what it could do. The dynamic range was, again, not as strong at all in the original. It felt much more squished and compressed, and then as you realized it was louder, it was a little foreboding on you, and you really couldn't get that clear distinction of what was going on in the record, whereas the dynamic range on the Analogue Productions was much better. Now, there's only so much that's there, so I gave it a 9. I mean, I think that the recording had some lack of ability to give you as much as you might want, and when I get to the Steven Wilson remix, that's where you start to see the ability of remixing it, not just remastering, but remixing it gives you the ability to bring things out more and make them more dynamic. So we had a 7.5 on the original and a 9 on the Analogue Productions. Soundstage and imaging, on the original, it was there, but it wasn't quite as clear, but it was there. But it definitely wasn't as strong as what we found in the Analogue Productions. So again, it's just a matter of peeling that layer of the onion more and more, and all of these things kind of get revealed. When it came to the voices, and of course, Ian Anderson's voice is a very distinct voice and a very present voice, and he can get up close to that mic. And you really could hear some of those distinctions on the Analogue Productions. And I gave it a 9, whereas the original was like a 7.5. Again, some of that was muddled in with the rest of the music and didn't give play to the very strong voice and distinct voice of Ian Anderson. So in the end, when we looked at the sonics and we didn't consider the vinyl quietness, the original was a 7.33 and the Analogue Productions a 9.25. And again, there's only so much one can do, I think, with this as it was originally recorded to 2-track stereo. When we consider the vinyl in there, then we're at 7.36 with the original and 9.29 with the Analogue Productions, again, about the same ratio. Cost-wise, of course, a $10 record, the cost per rating point was $1.36, whereas the cost per rating point for the Analogue Productions was $6.49. But, I mean, the two are night and day in terms of presentation. Now, again, You got to be able to turn the Analog production ones up to get that clear dynamics and the clear capability that's there to show you what's behind the wall and what's behind the curtain, so to speak, of this record. And when you do that, you gain a new appreciation for the way these songs were put together and the ability of these musicians to work together. And it really took it from kind of an audible experience to art, to an auditory art, to where you could hear things, and the painting of the sound was so much more present and so much more vivid in the Analog productions that it's just not even close. The numbers honestly don't even give weight to how much different these two really are. So you'll notice I really don't ever go in and give you ratings on the Steven Wilson type remix versus the originals, and there's a reason for that. To me, it's different. It's a reimagination of the record. It has definitely some changes in the way things sound left to right, what comes forward, what goes back, some of the instrumentation and or voices and their prioritization that they get. And it really is a new listen in a way. And it's a darn good one. And it really does add some spice to the original conception of what the album sounded like. Not in a destructive way and not in a way that takes away the intent of the artist, but in a way which gives us a fresher sound to the way things were from the original multi-track tapes. And that's why I call it a bit of reimagining. Now, it is very solid for the album benefit. It definitely brings forward some things that needed to be, gives better separation on some things, and to me, answers a lot of questions to what was in the original, what was in those original tapes. Again, the way Analog Productions took the original 2-track is how it got mixed down to the 2-track, and that's where they had to start from. Whereas a remix goes back to the original pieces and parts that made the record. So the Steven Wilson is definitely in the Jethro Tull catalog, in the Yes catalog, definitely something to enjoy and to listen to and give a different perspective to the music. But as it relates to this Analog Productions release, it really pulled the blanket off of the recording. It really gave life and vibrance. Now, you had to turn it up some because we did have that 4 dB or so decibel difference. But when you did, you really realized how quiet that vinyl was and how precise the sound was. The one channel on the original, the right channel, seemed to be turned down a bit from the left. And that became really apparent when I was switching back and forth between the two. Now, whether that was corrected, I'm not really sure, but in my original copy, that was something that was always there a bit. And so this balancing, bringing that back home was very helpful as well to the enjoyment of the album. But again, this is one of those that's an easy comparison to say that the new one really knocked it out of the park, brought a lot of the essential nutrients of this album and the ingredients that were there and brought them into a fresh listening experience. And that's really what I need from Jethro Tull because the material is so familiar. But the discovery with this Analog Productions release really brought the album to a new imaging that I really never knew existed in the original and made it all the more enjoyable because of it. So great job in Salina, Kansas to Chad and the mastering engineers of bringing this one home and giving us a solid reproduction of this classic Jethro Tull benefit album. As always, thanks for watching, and if you haven't subscribed, please consider doing so. Also, share this with your friends. Let them know I'm out there. I really appreciate the support, and a thumbs up or like is appreciated, as are your comments. So as always, until we catch you next time, thanks for joining me. Take care, everybody.